This is a relay project.
The Discourse starts right now with Cheryl Oates and Erica Barudis.
Welcome back to The Discourse. There is so much to catch up on Alberta politics. Today, we are talking the latest poll numbers, analysis on the NDP leadership race, and the province's newly announced police-like services. Those were air quotes for those who can't see me.
I was just going to point that out if you didn't. We're going to start with some of the legislation that was introduced this week. Minister Mike Ellis, Deputy Premier and Minister of Public Safety, introduced some changes, which include a 24/7 ankle monitor. But what was covered more was this introduction of a new organization that would work alongside police services across the province. These officers in the new agency would take on responsibility for, my air quotations, police-like functions currently carried out by the Alberta sheriffs.
But if you ask Mike Ellis, the minister responsible, we are not creating a new police force.
I think it is very important to state immediately that in the clearest terms possible, that this legislation does not create a provincial police service in replace of the RCMP. Our aim here is to bring the police-like functions that the Alberta sheriffs have taken on over time under the same kind of legislative framework and civilian oversight as Alberta's police services. The role of the sheriff's branch has changed incrementally over the years as the public safety needs and expectations of the community in Alberta have changed. These amendments will ensure that these police-like functions will be aligned with the legislation governing policing and are carried out by an independent agency that falls squarely under that legislation.
So police-like functions?
Okay, so
like, we're
that's
not
why
creating a new police force. Nobody worry, we're not creating a new police force, but we are creating a police-like force that may offer the police services in communities that are currently using the RCMP, but it's not a new police service. That makes absolutely no sense.
So I will say, you and I, from a comms perspective, it's like if you have to explain, you're losing. I think that this was like a miss from a comms perspective or policy or legislation rollout, because actually the piece of this legislation under the Public Status Amendment Act or Statutes Amendment Act was actually this introduction of the ankle bracelets. Like, I freaking love this policy. 24/7 high risk offenders have these ankle bracelets. Makes me feel more comfortable. I can understand the tangibility of this. You put a bracelet on, they get too, a pedophile gets too close to a playground, you're notified. Communities can be safer. I think that was the political and policy win. And unfortunately, the new or independent police force, I think, really took the day and the oxygen out of what I think is actually one of the best pieces of policy that this government has introduced.
But this is sort of how this government has done it, right? Like, we're going to do a whole bunch of wild stuff that we have not consulted on yet. We're going to have a whole bunch of pushback on it. And then we're going to seed our new policies with one tiny sparkly object that commentators or MLAs or whomever can say, oh, yeah, but what about this really good piece of this policy? We saw it with the transgender policy when people said, but we're trying to attract specialists here. Don't look at all this crazy stuff. That's what's happening in this case, too. Yes, okay, it's really hard to argue that we should be monitoring high-risk offenders who are released into our communities. But the part of this bill that makes no sense is the police-like services, and that's why it's getting all the attention.
I wouldn't compare it to the transgender policies because I think that's a whole different discussion that we could talk about for hours. But when it comes to, a very good piece of policy and then maybe one that wasn't explained as well, I thought at first, I was like, is this exactly, a move towards an Alberta police force? And so I was thinking about it, read about it, was reading the news release, things like that. And actually, I was kind of like, okay, why? Why are you doing this? Why now? And if it came down to me thinking about, what is Cheryl going to ask me? And thinking about, that's not my impression of you, by the way, for the record. But the government didn't campaign on this. Actually, they did. So they didn't campaign on this body, but they've campaigned on tough on crime. They've campaigned on public safety. They've campaigned on rural crime, which is huge. And so I'll actually say that I listened to the Premier on Ryan Jesperson's Real Talk, and she gave an explanation that I was actually like, okay, this makes sense. I wish this would have made it into the actual news release or the news conference or anything, because she came out and explained, okay, so a sheriff pulls someone over on the side of the road and they're finished, issuing the ticket on the highway. And then there's a call that a nearby farm is being broken into. Currently under the system, that doesn't happen, that they can't be the first responder, the closest individual certified to be able to go do that. This would allow them to then go and hopefully be able to catch the criminal in the act, as opposed to someone driving an hour to the site. So I do think that this is a change in scope, similar to what we've seen with like healthcare aides and registered nurse or pharmacists, expanding their scope to be able to allow them to do what they're totally qualified for. Is this the organizational body that the government campaigned on? No, but do I think that they're solving a problem that they did campaign on? Absolutely.
Okay, but those are very different things. And you can say, yes, tough on crime. We saw the UCP campaign on this, but it's not that they left this out of the campaign. Actually, Danielle Smith explicitly did not campaign on this. When asked questions about Alberta Police Force, when asked if she was going to talk about it, she said, no, we are not campaigning on an Alberta Police Service. And now Albertans voted the UCP in on a promise to bring doctors, a promise to fix healthcare, a promise to make life more affordable with a tax cut. We're not getting any of those things. We are getting the things that Danielle Smith explicitly promised not to campaign on and not to run on: CPP and an Alberta Police Service. So that feels like a bit of a bait and switch to me.
Okay, I'm gonna call you on coming totally out to get your key messages across about family doctors and healthcare and bait and switch. You can't trust Danielle Smith. Like, I feel like we're in May again, and I get why you're trying to play that angle.
But now she's walking the walk.
She's not on this one. So what I would say,
she explicitly said, I'm not running on an Alberta Police Service.
And she's not. What I actually think is the miss by this government is talking that we are not this is not that. And so I think they should have just done what they were doing because it's the right thing to do. And they should have come out and talked about, again, like, I think the ankle monitor is wonderful. I think this is great policy. And the way they rolled it out, I would give them, some advice to maybe have that as a standalone piece. I know that they're going to say we put a news release out an hour or two before. That's a huge, significant thing that regardless of your ideology, you can understand that this is about making your community safer. So I will admit that the miss, I think, was how this was done. However, so talking about this isn't this. I think their biggest error. But when it comes to the actual policy, how is this a bad policy? About having sheriffs be able to do things that they weren't able to do to be able to make communities safer?
There has to be another way to take the existing resources we have and put them in the places they are needed most without creating an entire provincial organization dedicated to it that Albertans have said they're not interested in. There has to be another way that isn't pushing the RCMP out of Alberta so that Alberta can create its own police service. I just don't think that all of the options have been explored. And when you look at the commentary, when you see the unions that represent sheriffs haven't been spoken to, the sheriffs haven't been spoken to, the municipalities that were blindsided by this and found out 30 minutes before it was announced, I don't know how the government could have landed at this being the best path forward without even talking to the most important stakeholders.
I don't know if I fully agree that they weren't all consulted, because I do think that this was something on rural crime that's been discussed on scope of sheriffs. The minister himself said that he did talk to sheriffs about what they can and cannot do. He's done training to understand the police and I don't think that's really the best term to use. And I did air quotation for my bubbly. But I do think that there is some value in this entity. It is independent, therefore it has a different board. It's not, governed in the same way. It has their own, from my understanding, judicial process that would happen. Again, do we need to make an organization? I don't know, but I'm trusting that the government knows if it's not. You're coming with a let's have this shared solution, but without a solution together. The government's presenting, and maybe it's not the only one, but I'm damn proud that something's being done about this, because I'm really sick of us going, like, I'm so sick of talking about public safety and not being tough on crime. I'm really sick of us.
Why can't we just give the Alberta sheriffs, a body that already exists? Why can't we just give them the power to do the police-like functions that they can't currently do?
I'm all for it. So, like, I don't know. I think that this is being taken out of context of, like, what does it really mean? What's the secret here? What's all this? And I'm like, you know what?
Yeah,
They're
that's
solving
what I'd
it.
like to know.
And I'm sitting here being like, good, you solved a damn problem, because I am so sick in this world. And I'm going to go on a rant about, like, public safety. Like, there's places that aren't safe. Rural crime has been a huge issue for years. Like, damn rights solve the problem. And that's what it sounds like this government is doing. You can disagree with the semantics or the organizations or operations or administrations or whatever. But you know what? If this has rewards and solves that problem that we've all been talking about for, gosh, like over 2 years in rural Alberta, this was in our platform in 2019. So let's just deal with it and stop complaining and bitching about the semantics of it.
But let me get this straight, because let's just pretend the shoe is on the other foot, and a different government with different political stripes was solving a problem by, one, creating more bureaucracy, and two, throwing money at it, as you would say. I don't think the UCP would support this plan.
Interesting, because most
Even
of
if
this
it is public safety.
there's not a lot in this budget, because I know that, like,
there's nothing in this budget,
but it's
which
from
is more
budgets
of the
before.
problem.
So if you look at some of this, especially around the ankle braces, which I think you can understand have innovation and technology attributed it, there was stuff in budget 23-24 that allocated some of that innovation and technology. And then in the next budget of 25-26 is the second, I guess, tranche of funds to be able to administer it, because you got to do the innovation of the ankle bracelet, and then you have to do the actual execution or operations. So if the argument is, well, they didn't put it in the budget, it's like, because it doesn't need to be, because there was budget before. And this is part of, and you know this, the budget rollout. We're in budget rollout season. So even though if it's not money in this
rollout, but typically when you roll out the budget, it was in the budget. Like, there's nothing on this in the budget, and the budget was a couple of weeks ago.
I know, but it's from last year's budget as part of the process. It's all the innovation money that they had to go towards this, and it's a damn good announcement. I don't care if it happened 2 months ago, 18 months ago.
Okay, but there are real
policy.
questions here, and you can say over and over again, like, it's a damn good announcement. Damn rights for fixing a problem. That's great, but, like, standing up an Alberta Police Service is going to cost a lot of money. And we just saw a fiscal plan from this government that goes into 2027, 2028 with nothing in it for a provincial police service, with a government that promises to balance the budget but is already spending more than they're bringing in revenue. So for me, like, not only does that really go against what Conservatives have run on forever, but it is a little duplicitous.
Okay, so let's put the shoe on the other foot for you. And what if this solves a problem and we see decrease in public safety? And what if this doesn't turn into an Alberta police force? Like, I think the argument coming from the left is, oh, this is them hiding on Alberta police force. What if this doesn't happen? And this is just, again, good policy, and it's put in place, and it was the body that was needed in order to, again, fill that gap of what federal and provincial jurisdiction can do to allow sheriffs, which are federal, to be able to operate within some of the provincial jurisdiction and be able to blend their skills. And what if that is? So is the NDP going to go up and, you know, we reduce public safety, or we allow sheriffs? We already see it in downtown Edmonton and Calgary, like sheriffs going alongside. Are the left going to then admit that it was good policy? Like, I guess my push point is, like, you're being very negative about something and being skeptical of where it's headed versus saying, I'm cautious of this, however.
No, I'm not. I am worried about it. I'm worried about it for a number of reasons. One is the minister stood in front of a press conference and said that basically he's preparing communities across Alberta to replace the RCMP with a provincial police service, when the RCMP have a contract into 2032. So yes, that is something that people should be worried about, because it came out of the minister's mouth. And yeah, you know what? If we have more public safety because of this policy and we can look down the road in 4 years, great. We will pat the UCP on the back. But at this point, because this is such a convoluted bill,
we the royal, who's ever the leader of the NDP, I'm like, well, Cheryl said.
but like, at this point, yeah, it's a piece of legislation in front of the legislature, and not only should it be scrutinized by the NDP because they're the opposition, but that is the public's the public's opportunity. Like, this is why the legislature exists. Let's look at the legislation. Let's look if it's a good priority for the government, if it's a good use of public resources, and the public can decide whether they support it or not. And at this point, I find it absolutely unnecessary.
So you will forever be skeptical of everything the government does, and
Yes.
that your party will forever do it because they're opposition, and that's, again, fair. What I'm trying to come at is, like, what if you look at it from the actual policy benefit that this could have, as opposed to the big bad wolf that I see the opposition trying to paint?
Well, the track record just doesn't lend itself to that kind of view. Like, so far, this government has done a lot of acting without talking to people, and more of like, well, let's introduce our policy, and if it doesn't work, we can fix it later. And I have yet to see any results from anything. And totally fair. It's a relatively new mandate, but like, given the track record, given the last year or beyond that with Danielle Smith in power, I just don't have a lot of reason to believe that they'll follow through in any of this.
Oh my gosh, I feel like talking track records is a good segue. Although I will say that I do think that I love the ankle bracelet policy, and it's my favorite of this government's thus far. But
hey, can
anyways.
I just wait? I just need to ask you something.
Yeah.
Like, is this feels to me like part of like a bigger, and this could be like totally the progressive conspiracy theory side, but like, what is this government moving towards? Like we have now, we want to separate and have our own pension plan. Let's get out of Canada on the pension plan. We want to separate and have our own police service. We have a Canadian Sovereignty Act. Like, the more I watch the government move to things that, Alberta can deliver on their own, the more I'm worried that they're preparing for something bigger than just independent administrative bodies. Like, this feels to me like a little bit like Alberta's bug out bag, and we're ready to leave. We're ready to get off the grid and leave the Federation if we need to.
Like our bunker.
Yeah.
No, I get where you're going with that. I don't think so. I mean, I would say I've had some pretty big conversations with the Premier about, like, there is part of our party or on the right that wants separation. She is not for that. She is definitely like, find what our lane is as a provincial government, find where the federal lane is. And I'm sure we could talk about them going head to head, and is that appropriate or not? But I think she's saying, like, here's our lane, here's your lane, stick in it, wants to stay in Confederation, wants to make it work. But I also think there's a huge piece, and I can fully relate to that, of like being really sick of how Alberta is viewed by the rest of our country. And is it fair? I don't think so. I'm sure if you went somewhere else, they might have the same perception. But I think it's about finding like ways that we can, as the Premier or as the government of the province, you look out for your people first. And if there's ways to explore that, and there's ways, whether it's through safety and being tougher on crime, because I do think some of this came from the federal government's, refusal to have bail reform and change up, and like getting people, like unsafe people, putting them back on the streets. So I do think part of this is in response to some of the stuff the federal government hasn't done. Although I do think still, like, we've talked about equalization, we've talked about the pension. I mean, I will say, I think the pension and in recent conversations, even the Premier herself admitted, like, Albertans aren't ready for that. I don't think we're going to see a referendum, I would bet, before the next election. Like, I just don't think it's something that Albertans were ready for. I think the government learned that from hearing it, and was like, okay, this maybe isn't an idea that is going to come forward anytime soon. And so that's, I think, why we've seen them so quiet. But if you are, I can at least give them credit for exploring things that are outside the box, because we do bitch and complain a lot about how we're treated, and I think it's rightfully fair in Alberta. But if you're not going to do something about it, what's the point of complaining? So
what I heard there was, so far, we're staying in Canada.
Correct. Always.
Okay,
that's
great.
the plan.
Okay.
We have no reason. So tuck that little conspiracy bunker theory. You don't need to go fill up on like dry cereal or anything like that.
Okay.
You're good.
Perfect. Thank you. Let's talk about how Danielle Smith is doing.
Mm-hmm.
Because we saw new polling numbers coming out this week.
Yeah.
And looking across the country at all the premiers and what their ratings are, Danielle Smith's numbers, relatively high. And interestingly, they haven't moved, which is, rare for a relatively new premier. But also, I'm sure her camp is happy that they're sitting as high as they are.
Yeah, I mean, you see a lot of ebbs and flows. You and I have talked about some divisive issues or conversations or topics or legislation that this party's brought in. And so I'm actually surprised that the rate is so consistent. I took a look back, and I think Premier Kenny's, you can guess when his approval rating started dipping, and it was obviously like very attributed to COVID. You look at Rachel Notley's, her record had her for the first 2 or 3 months in the 50s, and then for a majority, basically February of 2016 until the election in low 30s, high 20s. And that's actually, you know, a kind of typical place for premiers to operate in. So I would say the consistency in number is a big win. I would say if I was still in the premier's office, a big win. But I think the other thing to question is like, okay, can you move that up? Or is it you like a love or hate type of relationship? So that's, I think, the other thing I'm taking from the poll is like, is she convincing people that she's doing the right thing that didn't agree with her before? Or is it just like you're on one side or the other of the fence?
Yeah, I mean, typically, like those numbers move. They move over the course. Like if you look at any other premiers, almost any other premiers numbers, you see a honeymoon period after they have a renewed mandate or are newly elected, and then you see it slowly drop off. And you know, certain events obviously impact how their numbers do. If you think to Rachel's numbers, 2 really big things happened at the end of that first year. The carbon tax was introduced, and Bill 6 was introduced. And certainly, like, I wish they didn't, but those things had a big impact on approval numbers. In Danielle Smith's case, like it very well could be that these are, you know, this is the absolute peak for her. She's taken some big leaps. She's introduced what has been some pretty controversial topics. And what you can see is she's not losing support over them, but she's also not gaining support over any of them. And that could be good if she can hold it out for the next 3 years, but it also could be concerning to her team that nothing's boosting over them. Yeah.
So if we're looking at, you know, average of, you know, high 40s, let's say, for our viewers that can't see the poll, she's been pretty consistent the whole way through. I want to ask you kind of maybe a nerdy question. And do you think it's because some of her policies are, you know, more longer term than immediate ROI, that a lot of people aren't making up their minds until later out so they can see how some of these policies unfold? Like I think of, say, you know, reforming AHS, that's not something that's going to change overnight. And so you might just still be looking like, you know, was wait times reduced? Was surgical times reduced? How's emergency services or the growth of scope? Like, I think there's lots of things happening within the government that I think Albertans are actually just waiting to see it play out. And so I think you're right that, you know, time will tell. But I would also think that's probably why you're seeing more consistency than maybe we've seen, is she's doing a lot of generational policies, and that might not work out for her. But as of right now, it looks like people haven't decided that one way or the other.
I think there's a couple other pieces too to pull out of this. Yes, Danielle Smith's approved numbers are really high. They're not the highest in the country, but they're really high. But her disapproved numbers are also high. So that means, look, when people are asked this poll, like they're asked, do you strongly approve? Do you moderately approve? Do you moderately disapprove? Do you strongly disapprove? And when you put those last 2 categories together, Danielle Smith's numbers are high relative to the rest of the country. And what that tells me is, yes, she enjoys popularity, but she's also a really divisive figure in Canadian politics. And I think part of the reason that we're not seeing things move is, 1, like you said, these are long-term policies that she's introduced. 2, part of the reason that people were sort of unsure about Danielle Smith is because they thought that she, you know, wouldn't be a credible or level-headed leader. And she has really done a very good job and a dedicated job to sort of breaking that persona and making sure that people think that she's thoughtful and credible over her almost first full year of this mandate. And the third thing is, it's really hard for support to bleed to somewhere else when there isn't really a complete picture for that opposition party. And right now, the NDP is in a leadership race. People, when they picture the NDP, they're not sure what the next version or the next 3 years of that party will look like. And so it's really hard to consider an alternative when you're not quite sure what that alternative looks like yet.
Yeah, I do know the parties got a boost. Like the UCP pulled ahead when Rachel stepped down. And so good point on what does that mean for after the leadership race. I would say more for the parties than the leaders. I think that the reason, one of the big things that maybe was at a disadvantage for the NDP is going into a leadership race. They lost what I believe one of their core brands to be, which is Rachel Notley. And so it's going to be interesting how they shift. But I think that comes back to what I said earlier around, is it she has like a love camp and a hate camp, or like, you're very black and white with how you see our premier, and perhaps that's why it's more consistent. And like, I guess the real question that I'm going to take away from this is like, what does that mean for the UCP? What does that mean for policy that comes forward? What does that mean for how you position your leader? Again, where does she wear some of the big, bold moves, or where does that fall to some of the cabinet ministers to try and balance out, again, keeping her approval rating high? But like you said, there's not a lot of undecideds when it comes, I think, to Danielle Smith. And I think that's definitely going to play into the strategy of how you leverage your leader, especially coming out of the first year. Like I remember, primary part of my job was like the political side, right? So the political advice, the strategy, the pre-election, as coming to the transition team and being principal secretary, because I was part of the UCP institution. I wasn't on her campaign team. And so I was bringing that, what does it mean to be the leader of the UCP? And I know she was very self-aware, because she knew when she came into power that there was skepticism of not only our own party, but of all of Albertans. And she had a very short time to win them over. I know she worked her butt off to do that, both internally of the party and externally. And I think she got to a place before the election where, before the election, Rachel Notley was ahead of her, and so was the NDP ahead of the UCP, pulled it off. And now she's actually like figured out her stride, figured out where she needs to play, or where she needs to push as the premier versus letting her ministers take lead on things. And I think that's also why you see her being consistent in numbers. But you're right, with some of the upcoming leadership, some of, what we'll actually see in the next few years, I would be surprised if it stays the same for her full 4 years.
For sure. It has to move around a bit. And then we also have the added piece of the next federal election. And like we've talked about before, Danielle Smith has basically made her entire political identity fighting Justin Trudeau and fighting the federal Liberals. And if next year we do see a power change and we now have the federal Conservatives in power, that is a huge target, a huge storyline taken away from Danielle Smith. So that will obviously impact how she frames herself, how she positions herself, and could impact her favorability numbers as well.
Yeah, well, we'll be sticking around to be able to update people on that as it so happens. And that's really what I hope, is that we do have a federal Conservative government, just in case you didn't know that.
We knew.
Yeah. Just for the audience, it was deadpan. Those for our listeners, just like not even a smirk from Cheryl. Do we want to move over to our last topic of the NDP leadership? Because I texted you on Friday and I was like, who's in as it was coming through. So 6 candidates have been finalized for the Alberta NDP leadership race. That was on Friday, with all of them getting through the whole process of Elections Canada, signatures, funds, everything. So we have 4 sitting MLAs. We have Kathleen Ganley, who we've had on the show, Raki Pancholi, Sarah Hoffman, and Jody Calahoo Stonehouse. And then we head over to a man I've championed for, the Alberta Federation of Labor, Gil McGowan. He's entered the race. He's very active on Twitter, so make sure you give him a follow to see where he is. And then former Mayor Naheed Nenshi, who we had on our show last week. So we're already covered 2 of 6, which is great to be able to ask them all my burning questions.
Yeah, and we have time. Hopefully we'll have all of the candidates on the show. They were all finalized last week, so that means that they've paid their nomination fees. That means that they have all their signatures in from across Alberta. They had to collect signatures from regions across the province. And now they have until April 22nd to sell memberships and, of course, raise the next $20,000 to continue in the race. There may be a decision point over the coming weeks as candidates do that work about whether they continue in the race or whether they bow out and throw their support behind someone else. But I wanted to get an outside take because I feel like I'm like deeply into this every day.
I want to ask a question. Okay, so I think it's Sarah Hoffman. And the reason I would say that isn't because Naheed said he wasn't. I think he has star power, and I think he probably saw a big momentum push. My doubt for him is that he won't be able to sell memberships in the same way. I think Sarah Hoffman has like the manpower, the institution. She's very much, I think she's been campaigning for 10 years, right? Like I think she was always from outsider world, was always known as the successor. And so I see her as the front runner because I think she's got her, and like, you know this, in a very brief campaign time, you have to have your campaign, like your wheels moving and have your operations like teed up. And so I think she is the one I would believe that would have all that infrastructure and have already mapped it out. She's also been able, you know, to throw the rural girl authentically out there. I could see her sitting at a coffee shop, you know, in rural Alberta shooting the shit, you know? And so I think she's got a different dynamic because she's got the institutional knowledge and infrastructure, but she's also, I think, got a different audience than everyone where we see they're kind of competing for the centrist. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think Sarah has been a little underestimated. And people were rightly calling her, you know, the candidate that's going to kind of go behind the scenes and sell, and no one's going to quite know how far ahead she is until she's really far ahead. But I think she has proven that she can campaign on both levels. Like she's out there meeting people, selling memberships, shaking hands, leveraging the relationships, as you've rightly said, that she's been building over decades. But her air game has been great. Like I loved her launch video. I love her when Naheed Nenshi announced
rally,
and her quote said he should enter the race if he wants to be number 2. I was like, yeah, like that was, I mean, those are great clips that are getting played everywhere, and she's getting far more airtime than I think people
but I think that goes
to
show that she built her infrastructure for her campaign, and like she's probably not, she might text someone and say tweet this for me, but like, or someone has, but she surrounded herself with people that also know how to campaign. Yeah. For people that have never entered a leadership race, like I always joke that it's like you're like a car salesman. Like you're literally selling. All you do is try and turn around. And I'm sorry for car salesmen that might be mad at me for that. It's a term. Like, but what I mean is like it is like you're pounding pavement, and it is a hard thing to do. Like asking people to buy a membership to support you, and like how much do you value how much do you value me? Is it worth $5-10, and will you come out to vote? And you're, you know, it's just very transactional. And I think for someone like Naheed Nenshi to come in, or even Gil McGowan, who I can't remember if when Gil ran in Edmonton Centre if he had to do a nomination or was acclaimed, but membership sales are hard. Like this is a very unsexy behind the scenes game. You can have the best social media, you can have the best resume, or you know what you believe party support. If you're not asking people, if you don't stand in front of a mic every day and say, I need you to buy a membership for me and I need you to donate so that I can get around, and if you can't do that, I can't win. Like you almost have to be very vulnerable about like what that membership really means. And then you have to have a good get out the vote strategy. I mean, you could sell memberships across the province, but if you don't have a good mechanism to make sure that on election day those people get out to the polls, it is so different than a general election, and it's so different than any other form of election. So
yeah, and I think a lot of people watched Naheed Nenshi's launch and were like, okay, this guy has it. Like he's on the news, he's all over my social media, he's got endorsements, but truthfully, this doesn't come down to who has the best ability to pull national media. This, like those people watching this, you know, interested in the former mayor running in the NDP leadership in Toronto do not get a vote in this race. And so it doesn't come down to who has the best earned media strategy. It comes down to who has the most ability to sell new memberships and influence existing members. And that's really hard to tell from the outside because we just don't know how the candidates are spending their day every day.
So if I can shed a little light, because I have so much leadership experience, we actually have like the Jim Dinning or Gary Marr effect. And so two things. One, you guys have a preferential ballot, right? And so for listeners, like you rank people 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in this case. You don't have to, but if you do and you're the 6th person and you get knocked off, you will probably see like, you know, one of the maybe bottom ballot type of candidates partnering with, like, I could see Gil and Sarah, maybe from the union side, partnering, right? And so Gil's votes go to Sarah, right? So there's like this inside strategy of leadership too, to find alignment with your competitors, because their second vote might be what gets you over the top. So we'll see that unfold. But then the other piece is like preferential ballots, especially when you have 6 candidates, are way more unpredictable than, just picking your favorite. So Gary Marr and Ed Stelmach, like Gary Marr, who I worked for, used to say, he was like, so I won twice, because this was a different form where someone had to get over 50% on their first ballot to win. But then they'd knock off the last 2, and this is how the PCs used to do it. Gary Marr won twice and lost once and didn't become the leader of the party, and that was the same with Jim Jennings. Like they the middle guy slid up the into winning, and so we might see that with the NDP too, just because of how the ballot ranking system works.
Totally,
so,
you can sit in first the whole time and end up losing.
Yeah,
and we saw Danielle Smith was like she was, I can't remember what spot she was in on the first ballot, but it was nowhere near the top, and she just inched her way up and up and up.
Well, no, she was the highest, but Travis was way closer. I you could tell because of Danielle not making as many friends or partnerships, she had to win on the first ballot, or it was going to go like to the 5th or 6th. Then it did, because she wasn't everyone's second ballot. But like both of them, like her and Travis, kind of like inched along, and let me tell you, it took forever, and especially when most of us well, I was there, shockingly. But yeah, it's so interesting how the voting structure, the behind the scenes way that a leadership plays out. And I think that's something very surprising for some of even the candidates, right? How do you sell a membership, and then how do you make sure they show up? But how do you also make sure that other teams don't hate you because you might need to be their second or third choice, and that's what might makes you become the leader. It's a weird chess game. It's chess, not checkers, in the leadership race. And I think you guys haven't really experienced this. Lucky you. But it's going to be a big thing to see how Nenshi got a huge push on his first day, but can he hold that momentum? Or does he have or is it going to fall short? And my bet is that Sarah Hoffman's going to keep ticking away, like very humble, and sell more memberships than people will even fathom.
And I think some of this people will get a little bit more insight in, because the party is about to roll out at least 3 official debates. And of course, we've watched the campaigns of all 6 candidates up to this point, but a lot of people will be making up their mind when those candidates are on stage together with their ideas sort of held up for comparison. We'll be able to see not just how their policies rank against each other or stand up to each other's scrutiny, but also how they play together. And we'll get some insight, Erica, into what you're saying about like, how do you make nice? How do you form allegiances? How do you make sure that you get the runoff votes from your competitors? So I'm really looking forward to those, because I do think that these campaigns matter for the membership. And I think some people are holding back, waiting to see how the debates go before they really make up their minds.
And for those NDPers that are going to watch the debate, I highly encourage creating a game out of it. So do a bingo card. I can tell you, when I worked for Gary Marr, every time that Allison or the Dougs, so it was Doug Griffiths or Doug Horner, agreed with one another, like, well, I agree with Doug, but, and so you can see those dynamics where they're trying to like collaborate on things. We may have been sipping alcohol, which you had quite a few sips because they kept explaining with each other. But have fun with it, right? If you're going into these debates, bingo cards, bets, whatever you want to do, just to have fun with it, because you're right. You get to see a lot of like some of those strategic moves that are happening to form allegiances. It's like access and allies.
There you have it.
Yeah.
Erica has promised to make an NDP leadership bingo card. You can watch her Twitter at Barutis.
Oh my gosh, I'm going to start
there
today. Frick, now something to do tonight. Okay, well, that's our show. I gotta go start making this thing. But yeah, as you guys know, our new episodes drop every Thursday morning.
Please like and subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.
The Discourse is hosted by Cheryl Oates and Erica Barutis. Follow on Instagram at The Discourse Pod. Subscribe to The Discourse on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.